All right, so today we're going to talk about raising your frequency, right? Like this whole idea that that through meditation and cultivation practices and mind-body practices, you can raise the frequency of your being, and how I interpret that. And in order to do so, I'm going to take the analogy that I spoke about last time around, which is thinking of yourself as this wheel that sort of rolls on the ground of reality, and depending on how round the wheel is, that's how smooth your flow over reality goes, right? So once again, for the sake of rehashing that, we all start out as being a very angular wheel, right? So maybe you're a triangle or a or a square or something like that, or a pentagon. And that means that you're very clunky in the way you flow around reality. And all those sort of flat surfaces in which you get caught, that make your contact with reality very clunky and very with a lot of friction. Those are areas of yourself, either your psyche or your body, or your contact with reality that your mind perceives to be either something that you want to crave for or something that you want to push away. And that craving and that aversion makes your mind wrap itself around that object and be stuck, kind of sort of fixated on it. And that fixation prevents your mind from being in flow. So there's fixation on the one end and flow on the other. And the uncultivated mind has a lot of fixations, either to try to get good things or to avoid bad things. Whereas the cultivated mind has very few fixations, and so it flows with reality a lot easier. Now, I was thinking about, so what happens is, say that you start with a mind that has a triangular shape, right? Now, reality is flowing, and your mind as a triangle is trying to sort of keep up with that reality. It's going clunk, 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 like that, right? And what you immediately notice is that sort of clunkiness has a certain frequency to it, right? So reality flows, your triangular mind spins with reality, and that creates a frequency. So it's clunk, 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 clunk. So, but then you begin to get experiences in life, and you are no longer so hung up about certain things. So imagine for a moment that that through some meditation and some practicing here and that, you manage to have only half of the hang-ups and half of the chips on your shoulder and half of the traumas or half of the obsessions, or half of all the things that keep you stuck, right? So you suddenly reality feels a lot nicer to you. And many people will say, like, well, you've increased your frequency. And while that sounds like a very sort of fluffy thing, it's like, oh yeah, of course you increase your frequency, right? Whatever. Sounds very new agey. Think of it in that geometrical analogy again. You were a triangle, but through working out hang-ups in those sort of surfaces, you suddenly became a hexagon. Yeah, so you have twice the amounts of little angles in which you are directly in contact with reality, as opposed to sort of hung up on these surfaces. So now, as the wheel of your mind spins, the clunkiness has reduced to half. Or you could equally say that the amount of beats per second or whatever at which you perceive reality has doubled. So your frequency has doubled. So you have gone from clunk, 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 clunk to clunk, 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 right? So it's literally a doubling of the frequency with which you are in direct touch and flow with reality. That's literally what it means. And you could see where this is going, right? So as you engage in a formal and fully dedicated practice of mental cultivation or spiritual cultivation, which is what it can be also called, you keep filing away at those flat surfaces in the wheel of the mind where things are getting caught. Now, the way you detect those is through what's called emotional valence. And what that means is you have emotions, some of them have a nice flavor and some have an unpleasant flavor. But the valence is kind of the volume. So think of the valence as the volume of, in a scale from 0 to 10, just how pleasant or unpleasant is it. So something could be rather unpleasant, but it's like a 2 out of 10. So even though you dislike it, it's just like, it's kind of it's just kind of annoying, right? It kind of registers, but it's not that a big deal. At 5, things start to, really register and stuff. And you could call 10 a full-blown panic attack, or a, you've lost your marbles and you've gone completely, berserk, or things of that kind. So the valence of your emotional spikes is different, right? Unless you're a flatliner, kind of like a sociopath, which is on a flat line. And so what you start to do is you take valence as the indication for something that is a hang-up, something that is a flat surface on what should be a round wheel of the mind. And so the unpleasantness comes and you go, here's a flat angle. How do I smoothen it out? Well, you could try to just ignore it, but that's just going to make it flatter, right? You could try to push it away. That's going to make it even flatter. You could try to do all those things. What you do instead is you, as opposed to being stuck at the surface level of the wheel, you go back to the center of the wheel, which is the knowing awareness that you are. And from there, you observe that flat angle, that irritation, or that sort of, emotional valence. You have to observe the positive ones too, right? It's not just for the negative ones, it's for everything. And you go, there's a flat surface. I'm going to retreat to the center of the wheel. And that's what makes it rounder over time, right? Because the reason it's flat is because you are enmeshed with it. But as you separate from it, it rounds off because you know that you are safe, whatever shape it takes. So as that happens, of course, your wheel becomes more and more round until it's a lot smoother. Now imagine that you've gone from being a triangle of a mind that goes clunk, 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 being hung up on everything and just trying to control stuff and whatever, to being a mind that has 1,000 sides, right? Like it's almost a circle, but it still has flat areas, but it's got 1,000 of them. You can well imagine that you've gone from clunk, clunk, clunk to clunk, 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 clunk to clunk, clunk, to right to. It's almost like a drill, right? And you immediately then go like, that is the increase in the frequency. So your frequency has raised. You've raised your frequency. Your frequency of what? The frequency with which you are in direct touch with the flow of reality. That's what has increased. Now, it just so happens that to do so, you need to fully embrace things that you dislike and resolve them so that what used to be an angle becomes just a round area in the circle of your mind. And so as you resolve your hang-ups, your frequency increases, right? So when we're talking about raising your frequency, what we're talking about is raising the frequency with which you are in direct flow with reality versus being caught up in some hang-up, trying to control and cling to things, whether they are positive or negative. So so it's almost like we think of raising our frequency as just trying to be happier and stuff like that, but that's not what it is. Happiness is a byproduct that comes from resolving your hang-ups, both obsessions and aversions, and being more often and more and therefore in deeper touch with reality. So it's almost like the processor of your mind has gone to going from processing 5 bits per second to 1,000 bits per second. And when that happens, that's why people say like, wow, since I started meditating, everything looks so much clearer, and I'm more clear-headed. And the reason for that is that the mind has switched from a mode where it's trying to think about everything and control it by overthinking about it, to being in direct touch with sense perception and the flow of reality. So everything looks clearer. It's almost like you've upgraded your mind from an old computer with just a bunch of pixels to a new computer where things are in full color. And if you're a very good meditator and you're very much in flow, your mind has become an Apple Retina screen where literally you're processing things to such a degree, with such creamy level of perception that is almost as good as in real time perception of reality. So if you've raised your frequency, right? So when people talk about raising their frequency, it's become a new age term. And I hate to, I don't want to be a hater or anything, right? It's part of my discipline to try not to prop myself up to say like, see, I was the one who explained. But the fact is, a lot of people go like, yeah, man, you just got to raise your frequency. But what does it mean? It means raising the frequency with which you are in direct touch with reality, because you are not hung up on the past or the future. So that the wheel of your mind, you keep shaving angles off until it's becoming as round as it can be. Now, it is my sort of new kind of pet theory that becoming enlightened is having the perfect circle. Now, it may never become totally perfect, but you can taste moments, especially when you go into the jnanas during meditation, the absorptions, where you go into samadhi, where you get to what you could call like the 0 point, right? And the 0 point is, so as long as you have frequency, right, it keeps getting higher, but there is still, so long as there's sound, there's yes and no, up and down. But the 0 point is where the waveform just collapses, right? Like there's no up or down anymore. There's just like a flat line. And so to my experience, that's when your breath stops completely, your mind stops completely. There is no body, there is no personal self, there's just knowing isness. And it's like the void, right? Like the akasha, or the emptiness principle. And you can touch that, right? Like you can learn to bring the mind into that 0 point of no frequency whatsoever, right? Like the highest frequency is no frequency. And as you touch that point over and over again during meditation, you bring that back into your daily life, so that the wheel of the mind starts becoming rounder all the time. And it also gives you the vantage point from which hang-ups that are very deep and very painful to you can be resolved almost effortlessly, so long as you remember to bring yourself back to that 0 point and observe from there, right? So it's not enough to observe discomfort in the body and mindfulness-based stress techniques and stuff like that. Yeah, it's helpful, but to realize yourself as the observing being, so to speak, as the self, starts to give you that inner anchor. And the more you retreat to that inner anchor, the more you identify with it, which is what your real self is, and the less you identify with the periphery, including your mind and body, right? So that ironically, it is by living in the center, in the hub of the wheel, that makes it rounder, right? It's when you live in the periphery that you think that you need surfaces in order to contain force. But when you live in the center, there's no need to contain force, so the wheel becomes rounder, interestingly enough. Now, there is something interesting about the shape of the wheel as well, which is very, there's a couple of things. So one of them is this idea that a wheel, because of its shape, when force is inflicted into one point on the wheel, that force is distributed throughout the entire surface of the wheel. So it's more difficult to hurt it, so to speak. And as your mind becomes more circular, or almost like more of a sphere, if you will, you start to feel like there is no single point which, if affected, if hurt, your entire sense of self would collapse. That's very different when you have a triangular or pyramid type of mind, right? That mind is defensive because inherently it knows that it's weak. It knows it, right? It has all these sore spots which if pushed, they really hurt, and they make your sense of self collapse. So you have to prop them up, and that's why you have these surfaces that make you clunky and give you a false sense of security, right? So you develop these surfaces that you go, you're not going to touch me. Here's a surface. There you go. But that can be hit, and if one of those surfaces collapses, the entire structure collapses. Whereas in a ball, in a sphere, whatever point is pushed, the force gets distributed, and it has this tensegrity to it. So the force gets distributed everywhere, and the wheel goes like, hey, you can push me around, you can do whatever you want, but nothing really happens. And it's almost like the mind knows that in itself, which is why, as you start to meditate, at some point certain traumas or things start to arise, because the mind starts to perceive, you know what? I stored this in the system. If you want to know more about that, there's a video on trauma that I made. I stored it in the system when I felt that my integrity as an entity was low. I stored it somewhere in there, because if it was allowed to surface, my structure of self would collapse. But now I feel like I'm somewhat stronger now, so this thing is going to now pop to the surface so that it can be dealt with. And I think I can deal with it, right? So in a sense, the system of our mind allows things to arise as it feels that it can deal with them. Now, if it still can't deal with them, it's going to create an emotional outburst in you of either sadness or anxiety, fear, or anger, right? That's what's going to happen if you're still not ready, not mindful, not integral enough. It's going to create a burst, and then it's going to go away, and it's going to be stored until you're ready and you have enough integrity in the mind to deal with it. But there will come a point, and to me the point has come where I'm starting to even trigger myself on purpose, in fact, right? So go like, okay, let's, there's a hang up that's been eating up at me. Let's bring it up. Let's observe it with equanimity and from the heart of the self, and let it pass away, and start to de-energize it over time. Now, admittedly, when you do it on purpose, you feel like you're more in control, you have more integrity at that moment. So you feel like, come on, man, just bring it on, right? Whereas if something comes out of the blue from daily life and it's not voluntary and it takes you by surprise, it could still create an emotional outburst, and catching it in real time starts to become more the task. And so this idea that you acquire this integrity is very interesting. There is another interesting idea, and that is something that reminds me of the book Mindsight, which talks a lot about integration, right? And he never talks about becoming this spherical, very well integrated self, right? But he very much hints at it. He's like one step removed from it, literally, not more than that. But he mentions that an unintegrated mind, what I would call a triangle, is constantly moving between the extremes of chaos and rigidity, whereas a very integrated mind is in flow. So let's go back to the triangle and the circle. So when you are a triangle, you have this big surface that you're resting on, and reality is kind of grinding against it. And there comes a point where you just have to move because it's become untenable, right? So you had stability, but it was a kind of stuck type of stability. And now you're forced to change, and you go on to like this tiny little one point that keeps touch with reality, that one little angle, right? Like this one. Shit. How do you do that here, right? Like you're balancing on that thing all of a sudden. That's chaotic, like massively chaotic. You're like, oh my god, I don't know what's happening. I need to change, but I don't know how. And reality, that direct contact with reality is so uncertain and so scary. It just, it's pure chaos to you, right? Like that's how it's perceived. And then you land on your next on your next sort of surface, and once again you're rigid. So you go from, as you go clunk clunk clunk, it's a mind that is neurotically flipping between rigidity and chaos, rigidity chaos, right? And so like, oh my god, I don't know what's happening. Oh, I'm gonna stick to this now. Oh my god, I know. Oh, I'm gonna stick, right? And it's a neurotic flippancy. It's a system that is weak, okay? And I think that the triangle shape explains it perfectly, because you go clunk clunk, and in that going over the angle, as you switch to the next surface, everything is chaotic. You're scared as hell. It's like the time for a scary change, right? And when you're on the surface, it's the time for fixed rigidity, stuckness, right? Now, of course, as you move into the circle, you're always in touch with the now. So it's always moving, but it's not scary anymore, nor is it stuck. So it's not rigid or chaotic. It's in flow. That's the alternative, right? So and it makes you stronger. It just makes the mind stronger. So let's take this all these analogies, right? And so we talked about how as the system of your mind goes from being triangular or square or a pentagon to a wheel, the more surfaces you have, so that the rounder it looks, as it rolls, your frequency increases, right? Because it goes from dong, 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 to and then during meditation times it goes to silence, the 0 point, right? So that's what it means to raise your frequency. And that starts to cascade into daily life. We also talked about how a sphere, a circle or a sphere, has more tensegrity and integrity than a triangle or a pyramid. It has, if it's hit, it's distributed over the entire surface of it. And we also spoke about, what was the last one? When you have a lot of angles as a mind, you flip neurotically between chaos and fixation. Whereas when you are a round wheel of a mind, you are just in flow, right? So yeah, well, that was 23 minutes. I wanted to speak for about 5, but it looks like there was a lot to say. I love my own analogy. I've fallen in love with my own analogy about the triangle and the wheel of the mind. I think it explains a lot. It's just so happens that it explains frequency quite well, at least to me. I hope it resonates with whoever listens to this stuff. Cheers.